Hello and welcome. This is Module 2, Unit 3. We're going to be talking about interview methodology in this module. So the learning objectives associated with this short module are to describe interview as a qualitative research methodology, to be able to explain the components of an interview guide, which is used to conduct an interview to produce data, to detail some logistics about an interview, how and why and when interviews take place, and also to describe some interviewer roles and characteristics. So interview is one of many qualitative methods. An interview is an exchange between one interviewer and one respondent, guided by a few broad questions typically, and around a particular research question. So the interview itself can vary in type and in degrees of formality, in degrees of structuredness, and it can also vary in how it actually takes place. So whether it's face-to-face, whether it's online, whether it's on a phone. Excuse me. And to distinguish an interview from a focus group, an interview is again between two people, one person who is collecting the data and the other person from whom the data is being collected. And a focus group is a group of people, and the group discussion is the data. So while you can have a group interview, that is actually a group of people who are engaging in discussion around a particular research question. So we call it a focused group discussion rather than a one-on-one interview. Interview methodology is about the most common qualitative approach. Almost everyone has experienced an interview in some kind of way, an interview for a job, an interview for a volunteer position, an interview for a school. So it's the same methodology that we might use in a job interview or in marketing research, but we're employing it here for research methodology. So again, this interview method that I'm going to be describing can really vary on the degree to which it is structured and its formality. In qualitative research, we tend to lean towards open-ended and semi-structured ways of engaging in an interview rather than a more rigid and structured way that might be preferred in marketing research. And this is because we're typically using the interview to explore, to unpack, to dissect a very complicated issue for which we really don't know how to structure that inquiry. So the open-ended nature, the flexibility of this methodology is usually preferred in public health qualitative research. The interview, though, is organized around sets of questions that tend to be organized and flowing from more simple concepts, welcoming the interviewee into the conversation, to more complex questions. The questions shouldn't lead the interviewee to an answer, so there's all sorts of steps we have to take to control for our bias in the interview and the role of the interviewer in leading the interviewee in answering questions. In qualitative research, it's rare to see an interview that's less than an hour because it does take some time to have two people to be comfortable with each other in a conversation to produce rich data. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in an interview. The goal is to get good data. So good data is basically highly relevant, high-quality responses to our research questions. And there's some ways in which we can try to position ourselves to get that high-quality, relevant responses. And I'm going to talk about three ways. The first has to do with building trust and rapport between the interviewer and the interviewee. The second has to do with reinforcing good answers, and we'll talk about what a good answer is. There isn't a right answer, but there are some answers that best fit the area of inquiry in which we're interested. And the third is sustaining engagement. So during the interview process, being able to ask questions that are gentle and build on each other and are structured, and also moderator behavior and characteristics in which the moderator can kind of move with the conversation and remember and interpret as he or she goes along. So again, interviews can range from very structured and rigid, which is typically not of interest in qualitative research, to semi-structured or unstructured. That said, most interviews are not completely unstructured because we're trying to engage in a conversation that will produce data to answer a particular research question. Even if it's an explorative question, we want to have some boundaries around it. So a typical research guide starts with, an interview guide is a set of questions to provide some structure to the interview. And it typically begins with an introduction of who you are. That helps to build rapport. It typically starts with what some of us refer to as a grand tour question, a broad question that allows the interviewee to kind of tell any kind of story from wherever they're coming. And we can kind of use that grand tour question to begin to ask more key questions. And in qualitative research, our key questions tend to be on issues like experiences or behavior or opinions, perceptions, what people value, their feelings or their knowledge, because that's what qualitative research is really good at getting a handle on. And we use effective probes along the key questions to drive the conversation. Again, not bias the conversation, but to drive it in ways that will produce data that will help us answer our questions. So just some examples of a research guide. This is an example from our Determinants of Health class of a research guide. The first part of the guide collects the detailed information on the interview. So when did it occur? Who was the interviewer? Who was the interviewee? Where did it occur? How long did it last? And any kind of description. An interview can happen anywhere. I've conducted lots of interviews on park benches or in cars or in people's homes. It can also happen in a more traditional research setting. The interview guide, as I said before, is typically structured, starting out with a broad question like, can you tell me what your early life was like? Or how did you grow up? This is a grand tour question. Sometimes I'll ask a question, could you tell me about the birth of your child? Something very broad that an interviewee can easily step in and tell you a long story, and you can use that story to then ask more specific questions. So, for example, moving to the second section of the interview guide. So you told me about the kinds of works that you did. What kind of opportunities did you have in order to get the jobs that you did have? Did you ever have any difficulty making ends meet in working in the jobs that you worked in? So those are more directed questions. And then our interview tends to end with kind of the hardest questions, maybe those that are most sensitive, because during the interview you're trying to build up enough trust and rapport with the interviewee that he or she is willing to share more and more throughout the interview. And the interview tends to end with, is there anything else that I didn't ask that you'd like me to know? And this is deliberately in response to the fact that qualitative tries not to come in with rigid, preconceived notions, but tries to really open a space where the interviewee can share anything that's relevant to the overall research question. So the interview, I said before, we want to set the stage, we want to think about interaction, and we want to control the group interview. So let me talk a little bit about this. When we're setting the stage, that truly means kind of the built environment space in which the interview is happening. While this can happen at a bus station, on a park bench, while walking, there's a module in this series of modules about walking interviews. You do want to think about how you're sitting, the height, the distance, with whom you're sitting with your interviewee, and also just how you present yourself. There's lots of examples of people doing interviews with a clipboard. In public health and community settings, a clipboard is typically not a welcome way to present oneself. We want to minimize distractions. We want to be clear with how long the interview will last, and we often want to ask people to not check their smartphones or answer another phone. Sometimes we can't control those things, but we're trying to set the stage to produce the highest quality data, so minimizing distractions is important. And another important piece about setting the stage is just setting the stage for a respectful conversation. So being transparent about every stage of the interview and asking permission as you go along. We typically record interviews using an audio recorder. Increasingly, people are able to use smartphones as long as their institutional review boards approve of that. But asking, I'm about to turn on the recorder, is that okay? Okay, now I'm going to turn off the recorder. So emphasizing transparency and emphasizing confidentiality are important in an interview. The word interview itself has the word inter in it, which speaks to the importance of interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee. And again, when we're trying to build these high quality relevant responses, we want to attend to building trust and rapport, reinforcing good answers, and sustaining engagement. So we want to be in control. What this means is we want a conversation that produces data that answers our questions rather than a conversation that might go off-ramp to talk about something that's not part of the research study or is just not productive. So some examples of effective probes that we might use in an interview. One is actually the silent probe. Interviewers often kind of over-talk in a setting in which we can't get an interviewee talking. So remember that waiting for someone to answer, just nodding to responses, and really kind of giving these more nonverbal cues can be a really effective probe in making someone feel comfortable and willing and interested in sharing. Now, another kind of a probe is called a more details probe, which is a probe that asks, can you tell me more about that? Could you explain what you mean about that? Could you tell me something else about that? So it's a probe that helps you to hear more about the story. It can also help you figure out where in the story to jump in and to ask more explicit information. The last kind of probe I want to talk about is the echo probe, and this is a probe in which the interviewer tries to summarize what they're hearing. So this is what I'm hearing so far. Is that right? And that can help your interviewee know that you're listening. It can also be kind of a check on, are you interpreting this in the way that the interviewee wants you to? Are you making meaning in the same way that the interviewee wants you to? Some common challenges we have with interviews is the interviewee who doesn't have a lot to say or doesn't want to say a lot. One of the ways to address this challenge is to really think about our recruitment for our interviews. Who do we want to recruit? What kinds of stories might they have to share? And why might they want to share those in a research context? Another common challenge is really just this misunderstanding the nature of the questions. In research, we tend to frame questions in ways that don't make sense to non-researchers. So this is a really important reason why we should do research in partnership with people who are experiencing our phenomena of interest. So engage in community-based participatory research, for example. Another way to address and in a CBPR relationship, you can help create questions that make a lot more sense, kind of moving out this research language and making sure we have content validity in our questions that are also interpretable by lay communities. Reiterating the purpose of the interview, the purpose of research is also another way of helping to clarify questions that might sound funny or not sound relevant. Another big challenge is really just conversations that go off track. This is common and okay. It's okay that when a conversation goes off track, as long as we bring it back on track. So we tend to not train interviewers to say, I'm sorry, that's not what we want to talk about, because that can break down some of the trust and rapport that you're trying to build, but to say, well, that's really interesting. Can we go back to what we were talking about before? So an important way in which an interviewer is a good interviewer is to be able to listen and interpret meaning. So the echo probe I talked about before, this is what I'm hearing. Is that right? You can also reiterate the value of people's opinion and emphasize that when a research question doesn't make a lot of sense, to just ask for the story in their own words. When we conclude our interview, we tend to train interviewers to say, don't end abruptly. Start when you're starting to wind wind up the interview, you can say, I have about 10 more minutes, or I have about 2 more questions. You can use an elaboration probe as you're concluding. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Is there anything that you want us, the researchers, to know before I turn off the recorder? You can ask for clarification. You said this earlier. Before we end, can I hear more about this? So some of the best data is actually collected in the last few minutes of an interview. And so you make sure that you have that space for the interviewee to share things before the recorder goes off. Once the recorder goes off, it's not as if what's shared there is not data. It just won't be on the recorder. So it's important to get down your notes after an interview. Debriefing after an interview is a really important part of making meaning of what you learned from the interview. We often create a checkbox debriefing guide. Did I get at everything? Or even going back to your interview guide and saying, did I explore all the issues that I intended to explore, and what did I hear? I want to conclude with a couple of roles and tips for the interviewer. A good interviewer is really comfortable with the topics of the question. Why are we doing this research? Why is it important? Why are we talking to these particular people? A good interviewer puts people at ease, listens, is respectful, and can really interpret and explore things on your feet. So a really good interview tends to be comfortable, and the interviewer can have a set of questions in front of them, but really moves easily from question 1 to question 8 and back to 2 without having to look on their paper too much, because they know what they're asking about. Good eye contact and someone who makes the interviewee feel important in the exchange is also really important. Understanding your role as an interviewer is really important, because you are the instrument of data collection and you can influence the data. Often in an interview or in a focus group, the research participant asks the interviewer questions, but you really don't have the answers that the interviewee is looking for. We don't know the answers, which is why we're trying to build our understanding by building on the expertise and the experience of our interviewees. So we want to avoid getting too friendly, and we want to avoid agreeing with people's contributions, which is really hard because it's a natural inclination to nod and say, yes, that's right, that's valid. Instead, we try to say things like, well, that's very interesting. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That's very interesting. Rather than kind of an affirming answer, which might suggest that was the right answer, or that was the kind of answer that we wanted to hear. So some tips in conducting an interview: know why you're doing the interview. What are the research objectives? What is the purpose? Thinking about setting the stage is really important. Will this be a quiet space? Will this be a place where someone will feel comfortable talking to me? Thinking about interaction, how to get people talking is really critical. Knowing and being able to anticipate some challenges in the interview so you can know how to adapt so that you can control the interview to produce the best data possible. And this involves really practicing your interview skills, practicing the questions so that you can anticipate a question that's either really hard to answer or is not well understood. So that's the end of the module, just introducing the interview method as a method in qualitative research. There'll be more modules on different kinds of methods within qualitative research and how we analyze the data that we produce from these methods in subsequent modules. Thank you so much for listening.